I'm going to get us kicked off, and I just want to welcome everyone here today. My name is Heather Hooper. I am the Executive Director of Dementia Alliance of North Carolina. And, you know, this has been something that we've wanted to do for a while, and I'm glad that we can bring this to you and hopefully learn a lot. I know I'm excited to listen and today and kind of get that update on the research front. A little bit about Dementia Alliance. We are a statewide nonprofit organization, and our mission is to improve the lives of those living with dementia and help them get the care that they need. So care is comfort, assistance, resources, and education. And our programs are designed to help the person living with dementia as well as the caregiver throughout the caregiver journey, throughout the dementia journey. So we have our staff on here today. We have Dee Dee, our dementia navigator and director of family services. We have Lisa, who's our director of education, and Diana, who is our marketing specialist, here with us. And so we are happy to help. There's also a wealth of knowledge in the dementia world right on this call. I'm just so impressed with all the people that are here. And so I just encourage you to reach out if you or your loved one need help. We are here even during the pandemic. We are available via phone call or Zoom call or however you need us, and just to know that you're not going through this alone. We are so excited to partner with the Registry for Brain Health in North Carolina. I hope I did not get that wrong. But this is really a collaboration among the universities, among our dementia organizations. A lot of organizations are coming together to say this needs to be addressed and we want to do something about it. And it's the first registry of its kind in the state of North Carolina. And we'll hear a little bit more about that. And I hope at the end of this, you guys will all go on their website and sign up. It's so easy. And really just come together and learn more about what's being done for brain health, for Alzheimer's, for dementia in our state, and on the research front. I'm also excited to have our wonderful board member, Kathleen Welsh-Bohmer, to really come and give us an update, answer your questions about research. And I encourage you to put any questions that you do have. We have the ones that you submitted when registering, but if you have additional questions, put those in the chat and we'll try to be monitoring those, and Lisa will be kind of moderating that discussion. So about our wonderful speaker, Kathy is a professor of psychiatry with a secondary appointment in the Department of Neurology. And her research activities have focused around developing effective prevention and treatment strategies to delay the onset of cognitive disorders occurring later in life. And she currently directs the Alzheimer's disease therapeutic area within Duke Clinical Research Institute, and she collaborates actively with Verify, a Durham-based company, to develop reliable digital cognitive and functional assessment tools for early Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. So with that, I'm going to keep my part short and simple because I really want to get to the meat of this discussion and turn it over to Dr. Welsh-Bohmer. Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much, Heather. Let me see if I can pull up my slides. Can you see that? I'm seeing some head shake of yes, affirmative. Yep. So great. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm Kathy Welsh-Bohmer, as Heather was mentioning, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Rachel Dewees, who is our executive coordinator for the North Carolina Registry for Brain Health, which we'll be telling you more about later in this discussion here today. Really, the whole mission, if you will, of the North Carolina Registry for Brain Health is to get information out to people across the state about Alzheimer's related dementias and the things that we can do to enhance our brain health. So it's about education. And it's also about giving access to research studies that are going on across the state within the 5 partnering academic institutions for Alzheimer's and related dementias. So first of my disclosures, as was already mentioned, I do have a contract with Verify. It's a Durham-based private company. We're developing effective tools to help us in clinical trials for dementia. And I also consult with pharmaceutical companies, most recently with Takeda and with Biogen. So I'd like to start by just noting where we are, and then I'm going to talk about where we're going. So I'm actually getting older myself. We all are aging. Some are younger than others. And I can say that there are lots of benefits of getting older. We can look forward to retirement, travel, or at least we used to be able to travel, and enjoying family and friends. But as we get older, of course, there become an increased frequency of age-associated health conditions that we worry about, and certainly about memory loss. And so we end up, when we have little slippages in our thinking and memory, worrying about whether or not we're looking at the early signs of something like a dementia or Alzheimer's disease. And so what I'm planning to do in the short time that we have here today is to talk about basically 3 different topics. I'm going to talk about what is dementia and what is Alzheimer's disease. Then we'll move into what are some of the effective treatments that are either available or being developed for these conditions. And then what can we do to either delay getting these dementias or prevent them from getting worse over time. So I'll start off by talking about what is the difference between Alzheimer's and what's the difference between that condition and dementia. Dementia is an umbrella term. I think this audience probably is already very familiar with this, so I'll go through it pretty quickly, but it's an umbrella term. It's a syndrome, and it describes having difficulty with thinking and memory that impacts function. So it interferes with the ability to do things normally in everyday life. Now, Alzheimer's disease is a form of dementia, and it accounts for 60 to 80% of the dementias that we see in later life. Running a close second behind that are both the Lewy body dementias, which have a different pathology from Alzheimer's disease. It's very similar to Parkinson's disease and affects circuits of the brain that overlap with Alzheimer's. And then vascular dementia, which is often caused by either small strokes or by larger vessel strokes that cause cognitive impairment. Far less common are the frontotemporal dementias, which are quite devastating and involve impairments in behavior and personality. And then other forms of Parkinson's and Huntington's and other types of dementia that can occur in later life and can occur in younger life as well. What's probably the most common cause of dementia is actually a mix of dementia. So these things can occur in isolation, but often they can occur together. Most commonly are Lewy body and Alzheimer's occurring together, or vascular and Alzheimer's occurring together. And that's why we have the 60 to 80% figure for Alzheimer's, is that perhaps 50% is Alzheimer's alone, but another great percentage of patients who are affected by Alzheimer's also have another condition going on at the same time. And that's going to be important as we develop therapeutics, because some drugs may work on one type of disease and others may be more effective in other diseases, and some may be effective in combined pathologies. So these are the common figures that are cited by the Alzheimer's Association based on epidemiological studies. So we currently know that there's about 5.8 million Americans affected by Alzheimer's and related conditions. It comes at a huge price tag, particularly a price tag in unpaid caregivers that must exit the workforce and help take care of a loved one who's affected by a memory disorder or cognitive disorder. In North Carolina, the estimates currently are about 180,000 affected, but with the increase in the population moving into the state, as well as the population already here and aging, we're expecting that probably that number will rise over the next number of years to over 25% over the current estimate, somewhere in the order of 210,000 North Carolinians or more affected by Alzheimer's and related conditions. If we don't find a treatment by the year 2050, this is the price tag that our country will be looking at. So the numbers will grow dramatically from the 5.8 million currently affected, nearly tripling to 14 million, carrying a price tag of over $1 trillion and involving in excess of 45 million unpaid caregivers. So it's going to have a huge impact directly on patients, directly on their families, and directly on everybody in this country as we try to shoulder the costs that will be occurring as a function of these conditions. And it's probably that latter point that got Congress's attention, because when it was recognized of what this was going to cost us economically, it really required some action to try and get ahead of it. So in 2011, the National Alzheimer's Project Act was, if you can believe it, unanimously signed by both houses and passed into law. And it's designed to create a national strategic plan to address the problem that I just articulated. They announced in 2013 the ambitious goal of trying to develop treatments that would slow the progression and prevent the onset of Alzheimer's disease in just 12 years from when they made that announcement. So that was considered quite ambitious at the time, but nonetheless was the objective. And they put muscle behind it. They put money behind it, because that's the only way we're going to make progress, that and participation of people in research. So in 2014, the total appropriation was $737 million. A summit of key scientists involved in doing Alzheimer's and related dementia research got together and submitted their recommendations. They noted that the funding level at that current funding level would get us nowhere near the goal of having treatments by 2025. And in order to meet that goal, it would require $2 billion in annual research funding. So consequently, there's been an incremental increase over the last 5 years in the budget for Alzheimer's disease research funding. And as of this year, we've exceeded that goal, and we're now at $2.8 billion. That was due to the last appropriation of $350 million that really pushed us well over that $2 billion mark. And as a result of this increase in funding and attention to Alzheimer's and related conditions, scientists are now able to work at a much more rapid pace. We're advancing basic knowledge of the disease. We're exploring ways to reduce risk. We've uncovered new biomarkers that are making early diagnosis and drug development much easier. And we're actually on the track of developing potential treatments. So we've got sort of a bad news, good news situation going on here currently in 2020, but we've made a lot of progress. So on the bad news side of the equation, there's no treatment yet that will allow us to prevent the disease from occurring, and there's no treatment yet to stop the disease once it has started. But there's been considerable progress in our scientific understanding of the biology of the disease and other diseases. There's been advances in technology that are allowing earlier diagnosis and treatment possibilities. There's been evidence-based approaches that give us some information about how to lower risk and promote healthy cognition. And importantly, there's promising clinical trials now suggesting that treatments might actually be within reach. So I think let me back up. I put the slide up here like this with the scales to show that I think that the good news is far outweighing the bad news at this moment. So I want to just move quickly to talking about how we're doing our drug development currently. And it really rests on our ability to reliably detect disease and distinguish it from those other forms of dementia that I highlighted at the start. So I want to speak just a bit about what is Alzheimer's disease. I'm sure you're all probably aware of this, but it's really defined by a problem that's occurring over time within the brain, leading to the aggregation of two proteins, abnormal proteins that create toxicity in the brain and cell death. So the first of these proteins is beta amyloid. So amyloid is a normal protein that we all have. It's important for many different cellular processes, probably is a protein that is activated when we have injury to the brain. And it's usually trafficked out of the brain quite effectively, but over time, there can be some mistakes in the trafficking that occur, and it leads to a kind of a cut of the protein into smaller bits that are supposed to be cleared from the system, but it's cut in the wrong place, becomes a sticky little peptide that's floating outside the nerve cells and cannot be cleared because it's so sticky. It cannot be cleared from the brain. So it creates toxicity and havoc in the brain. And what you see here in the middle of the slide is the dark peptide, or the amyloid core. And around it, you see a debris field, which is full of dying and dead neurons, as well as inflammation and just other debris that's adhering to that inner sticky core. And we call this the amyloid plaque. That becomes one of the early signatures of Alzheimer's disease, and probably is the early initiating event of Alzheimer's disease. Nearly simultaneously with that, we also see the aggregation of another protein abnormally within the nerve cell. So the first one's outside of the nerve cell, the amyloid plaque, and within certain nerve cells, we see the aggregation of what we call the tau protein. So tau is normally a protein that stabilizes the tubules that are running up and down the nerve cell that are important for transportation of things from the cell body down to the end of the nerve. And what happens is this protein becomes what we call phosphorylated. This will be important later when I talk about biomarkers. And that phosphorylation causes that protein to cross-link like this, and it makes it difficult then to transport things up and down the cell when you've got the railroad tracks that are now forming these kind of X's instead of nice parallel lines. And so these two protein abnormalities, the plaque and the neurofibrillary tangle, which is caused by this abnormal tau, create the signatures that we look for in the brain of patients with Alzheimer's disease. As the toxicity continues to accrue, we get cell death, and that cell death leads to a loss of the neurons throughout the brain, and what you end up having is a shrinkage of the brain material as those cells are lost. And so if you look at the top of the slide, you can see a healthy brain on the left, and you can see an Alzheimer's brain on the right. These are from two individuals at postmortem who were the same age, one without disease and one with the disease. So we look for that characteristic as well to tell us that there's been some terrible disease going on that's led to cell death. Then we look under the microscope to confirm what is the cause of that cell loss, and the plaques and the tangles allow us to know it's Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's, like many late life conditions, is a chronic condition that occurs over a very long time frame. And as with any disease and trying to develop treatments, the strategy is really to start early. Even as we're seeing now with other infectious diseases, right? The idea is to identify it early, intervene early, so that we can have an impact. We now recognize that Alzheimer's disease probably occurs over 20 to 30 years, and that it has three distinct stages. First, there's a silent stage, or the latent stage, where those plaques and tangles are beginning to accrue throughout the brain, but there's no symptomatic impact of that yet. As that damage continues to develop, eventually there's some mild symptoms that emerge, and we call that the prodromal stage, or mild cognitive impairment. And again, as the disease continues to progress, at some point function becomes impaired, and we call that the fully symptomatic stage, or the dementia stage of the illness. Typically, treatments in the past targeted when people moved from an early symptom phase into a dementia phase. And that was because we had no way of really identifying people early to be able to intervene reliably early in their illness. But now, because of the developments that we have in understanding the biology, we now have biomarkers that allow us to identify people who are having ambiguous symptoms or no symptoms at all, but show the signs of Alzheimer's disease within their brain. And so now different treatment trials are aimed at this point in the illness, right before people begin to transition into fully symptomatic stages of disease. So let me just tell you a little bit about the biomarkers. There are things that we call imaging biomarkers and fluid biomarkers, and they're depicted here. So first we can measure proteins that are occurring, abnormal proteins, that amyloid and tau in cerebrospinal fluid, or we can use imaging studies like positron emission tomography to measure amyloid and to measure tau in the brain. And what you can see here is an amyloid imaging scan. So if you look on the far right, you can see lots of bright colors, and that's indicating binding of the agent to the amyloid in the brain. And you can compare that to the far left side where you see nice cool colors, and that's indicating very low or no binding in that individual. And then what you can see in the middle is an individual that looks pretty similar to the Alzheimer's disease patient. That's another individual who has no symptoms of disease, but their brain is lighting up and showing amyloid within the brain. And this is now allowing us to identify a subset of people who may be in the early stages of the illness who are at risk for developing cognitive symptoms, already showing amyloid or showing tau in their brain. And then we can target drug treatments in individuals who are at that early stage before the symptoms are being manifest. One study that came out in 2015 compared whether or not CSF biomarkers were better than the imaging biomarkers. And while this is a busy slide, the bottom line is that they basically are of similar accuracy. So when they looked at measures of amyloid and tau in the CSF and compared them to amyloid PET studies, they found the accuracy was in the order of 93%, essentially, with each of those different measurements. And when they looked at both together in patients, they found that adding them together gave virtually no improvement in diagnostic accuracy. And the reason that that's important is that it now gives us options for how we might be able to use these biomarkers when identifying people at high risk for developing disease. Not everybody is going to be able to go through PET imaging, nor is everybody able to get a spinal tap. So this allows two different options that would be equally effective in identifying individuals at risk. Just this last summer, we had more exciting news. So there's been a lot of progress in developing blood-based biomarkers, and we believe that they're actually on the horizon. So these are taking blood samples and measuring amyloid and tau proteins in blood. These have obvious advantages of being a lot more convenient and coming at a lower price tag than doing an expensive imaging study. Because it's using blood, which is further removed from the brain than doing an imaging scan, which gives you a direct picture of the brain, or measuring proteins in CSF, it has a lower limit in terms of accuracy. But we're thinking that these blood tests may be a really crucial tool to give clinicians that might be used to screen patients for whether or not they show signs of these abnormal proteins before putting them through more extensive testing. So how have these markers then helped to facilitate drug development, and what's out there in terms of the drug development pipeline? So the current medications that we have for Alzheimer's disease are what we call symptom modifying agents. So they're approved therapies for Alzheimer's disease are the cholinesterase inhibitors that you see listed here. Donepezil is also known as Aricept. They were approved in the 90s. They were followed then by another class of agent called memantine. And all of these work by making attention and cognition a little sharper. They don't change the underlying biology of the disease, so they're not considered disease modifying. Since the 2003, there have been no other drugs that have been approved for Alzheimer's disease or for MCI due to Alzheimer's disease. And as noted, these are symptomatic treatments, not impacting brain pathology. But with the advent of biomarkers, a whole slew of studies emerged looking at promising agents that might lower that triggering protein, that amyloid in brain. And as you've probably seen over the last 5 years, there's been a number of disappointments. So billions of dollars spent on this type of research to try and change the underlying biology with a 99.6 fail rate in those very promising trials. But that hasn't been discouraging people. What I like to say is that although those are reported in the press as failures, science is incremental. And we've learned from each of those quote unquote failed trials what agents look like they might be working in different subsets of patients that then lead to a next generation cognitive or clinical trial, excuse me, aimed at trying to change the biology of the illness. Currently, in 2020, there are 121 different agents that are in the clinical trial pipeline. And so what you see here are the ones that are closest to approval or phase 3, the inner concentric circle. And as you go further out, those are drugs that are in the early development pipeline, such as in early safety studies. Anything in red is something that's amyloid lowering. Anything that's in blue is tau. And then you see a lot of other colors there, indicating there's a lot of other mechanisms that are being targeted. Currently, the amyloid lowering drugs are the closest to approval, but there are lots of non-amyloid targets that are in the pipeline, including drugs that are aimed at inflammation, which may have a broad impact, not just on Alzheimer's, but on other dementias as well. There are some that are aimed at synapses, neuronal protection, vascular factors, the creation of new neurons or neurogenesis, and other factors that can affect the overall health of neurons within the nervous system. There's one drug that you may have heard about that was before the FDA just 2 weeks ago. This is a drug that was developed by Biogen. It's an amyloid lowering drug. Its early phase 2 work was showing a lot of promise. The name of the drug is aducanumab, and it lowers the very toxic forms of amyloid beta protein in the brain. And so they had reported back in 2016 that monthly infusions of this amyloid-directed antibody reduced the aggregation of amyloid plaques in the treated patients. And you can see this here if you contrast the left baseline scans to the right scans in the same individual 1 year later. You can see that the brightness is being reduced in most of those patients. And there was actually a dose effect. There's no effect in the placebo group at the very top of the slide here, but you can see both the 3, 6, and 10 milligram dose was reducing the aggregation of amyloid in those individual patients. Now, this, of course, wasn't seen in all patients. These are just examples of some of the responders. They also reported that function and cognition appeared to be improving in people that were on the drug. And they showed that the treatment 3 years later seemed to continue in a time and dose-dependent manner. So it was very encouraging phase 2 work back in 2016 that then led to 2 larger phase 3 trials, which are the ones that are before the FDA currently. So there were 2 trials, Engage and Emerge, that were conducted. They're identical in their design, but they showed conflicting results when it came to the interim analysis. So most studies have an interim analysis that's done to see if the drug is looking like it's going to work if they go the full duration of the study. And when they did those analyses, those planned analyses, they got 2 different results from these identical studies. So the Emerge study that you see here showed convincing target engagement. It was lowering amyloid in the people that were treated with the compound, the lowering compound, and in a dose-dependent manner. So the blue line are the people that were on the low dose of the drug and the green on the higher dose, and the top gray line is the placebo group. So you can see their amyloid in brain remains stable over the duration of the trial, but it's declining in the people that are on the drug, and it's declining in a manner that makes sense, where the high dose is actually more effective than the low dose. And then when they looked at all the different kinds of cognitive measures and functional measures on the high dose, they saw, again, a dose-dependent effect. So you can see that people are improving more. So you can see these percentages go in the downward direction. These are showing a difference from placebo. So people who were on the high dose are actually showing a greater improvement when they're on the high dose compared to the low dose with the blue bars, and it's being seen across the different endpoints. So they have a functional measure called the CDR sum of boxes, and they have cognitive measures, MMSE and ADAS-Cog, and then they have a caregiver measure of the person's function called the ADL, and all of those are improving compared to placebo. Now, when we look at the ENGAGE trial, so the identical trial, what we see is again that there's a lowering in the brain amyloid, and again in a dose-dependent manner. The two groups on the low dose in ENGAGE and the low dose in EMERGE are identical. The blue lines are essentially identical. But the difference between the high and the low group in this trial was much smaller than it was in the EMERGE trial. So in the same direction, but not of the same magnitude. And compared to what I just showed you for EMERGE, you can see that there's really no difference between the high and the low dose groups, but we are seeing some improvement. So the data went before the FDA on November 6th, and an advisory board voted unanimously not to approve the drug, and they based it on arguments of statistical overreach and potential flaws in the design and the analysis. And those were compelling arguments. But there was also a strong argument. It's a 6-hour session. You can listen to it actually on the FDA site. So all of this is very transparent. There was a strong counter argument that was voiced by the sponsor that was showing that they felt that there was consistency across all of the data from the phase 2 and the phase 3 studies. So they were saying that there was strong evidence of efficacy. There was also a strong push from patient advocacy groups. So the FDA is taking all of this information under advisement, and they'll make a decision by March 31st. So we're waiting to see what will happen and whether or not the drug will be approved. Perhaps it'll be approved with some continued monitoring. We don't know, but we'll know by March 31st what their decision is on this drug. Well, what about other treatments? So with the funding from NAPA, lots of other treatments in other areas have also been accelerating. With Lewy body dementia, currently patients are treated with some of the same drugs that are used in Alzheimer's disease. The one that is approved for Lewy body dementia is rivastigmine. The other drugs are used off-label. While there's fewer clinical trials than in Alzheimer's disease, there are a number of really interesting and important studies that are underway right now that are targeting the underlying biology of Lewy body dementia, and also looking at how to treat the sleep disorder and other symptoms that occur in that illness. And you can see some of them listed here. One of the ones that I think is particularly intriguing is one that will start, hasn't started yet, but is involving infusions of bone marrow-derived stem cells. And with frontotemporal dementia, again, an even rarer condition, but there's some really interesting drugs that are being looked at that affect the genetics of this illness. Excuse me, I didn't mean to go forward. And other targets that I mentioned briefly that are looking at neuroinflammation and reducing specific pathologies with Alzheimer's disease. And currently there's one trial that's also looking at reducing inflammation with a dietary supplement that shows promising results, early results. So while we wait for this, the question is there anything we can do to help our brains and to try and prevent continued decline if we're already having memory problems or other problems? And so I like to say, yes, there is some evidence that there are 7 basic things that can be done to reduce risk of disease and potentially have a positive impact on either memory decline or dementia progression. And so quickly, I'll just eliminate what those things are. You've probably heard of many of them, but they are supported by a body of evidence. The first is really to treat what we can treat and to get our head wrapped around the mindset that we're not powerless in this and that there are things that we can do. And most important is really to stay involved and engaged with others. In some countries, there's actually being a lot of resources are being put towards trying to keep people longer in the workforce as an opportunity to continue to engage the brain and to be around other people and keep active in life. As I mentioned, treat what we can treat. So it's important that patients are being followed regularly to make sure that if there's any underlying conditions that can contribute to brain health, that those are being addressed, and you can see many of them listed here. That's not an exclusive list. The big ones, of course, are to stop some of the conditions that we know have a poor impact on brain health, which is excessive alcohol consumption and smoking. Exercise is medicine. There's lots of compelling evidence that exercise improves brain health. And basically the message is to be up and moving. And then watching what we eat. So a healthy diet that is basically the diet used to ensure cardiovascular health is the same recommendations that are used for brain health. Essentially, anything that's high in fruit and any diet high in fruit and vegetables is neuroprotective and reduces oxidative injury to the brain. Finally, working your brain, engaging it in novel ways. So we don't need to be skydiving, but the idea here is really to engage in new things, new learning, things you haven't done before, in terms of creating new connections, new brain connections. It's been shown in many animal models and in humans that having new connections forms provides redundancy in the brain and buffers against damage that occurs in those circuits over time. Finally, step 6, easy to say these days and much harder to do, stress reduction and caring for your emotional health. And so, like I say, it's easy to say, lots of evidence that this is important, particularly getting good rest. What I can say now in the middle of COVID is to take advantage of those support groups, particularly the virtual support groups, as that's one way of engaging with others and trying to reduce stress. And finally, being a part of research. I think that's an important part of the formula of things that we can do for our own brain health. So as I've mentioned, science has come a long way in the last 30 years. We don't have a cure yet for these conditions, but we're hopeful that one or more may be on the horizon. There are many different treatments for different stages of disease that are under current development, but we really need help in terms of trying to accelerate forward and discover what's going to work in these different conditions. And it's important to recognize that we're all getting older and we're all in this together. So by getting involved in research, we're helping one another get closer to a strategy that might work for us all. So how can you be a part of it? You can join the Registry for Brain Health. So as we said at the top of the hour, we've just been funded as in supporting a registry for brain health. This is a online registry where you sign up, and it's simply to hear about research that's launching across the state so that you can consider whether or not you want to get involved. You are not signing up for a research study. You're only signing up to get information. It also is a vehicle for us to push out information to you about exciting new things that are happening in this area of research. So it's both a way for you to get information and for us to share some of the new exciting things that we're hearing about across the globe. The 5 partners that are involved in this are listed here. So Wake Forest University School of Medicine, North Carolina A&T, UNC Chapel Hill, East Carolina University, and Duke University. Right now we have over 5,000 people who are registered. Vast majority tend to be women. And the age ranges are depicted here. Most people are in their 60s and 70s. But we are beginning to get younger people, and that's important because we know paying attention to brain health is important from young adulthood all the way into later adulthood. We have diversity in our education representation, and that's important. We want to make sure whatever therapies we develop will generalize across the entire population, and we have good racial diversity, with approximately 30% of those registered coming from, self-identifying as coming from a minority group, the majority identifying as being African American. And we have a smaller percentage of Latinos and Hispanics, and we're hoping to improve that over time as well. So all you have to do is go to our webpage, North Carolina Registry for Brain Health, click the button, and it'll take you to a page where you can sign up to get information. Some of the studies that we've been recruiting for is one out of Wake Forest that we've been partnering with at Duke called the EXERT study. It's an exercise trial that's ongoing currently. Retinal studies that are still continuing, a different way that we might be able to look at the eye and look at biomarkers associated with a variety of different dementias. And then brain imaging studies in people who are at risk for developing disease. And we're also working on computer applications to better measure cognition in a way that's more enjoyable than the typical paper and pencil tests and might be used in clinical trials. For those that are looking for help right now, the website also publishes different resources that may be useful to patients and their families. Some are listed here and here. And we also put information not just about Alzheimer's disease, but about the other dementias as well, including FTD and Lewy body that you see listed here. So I want to thank all of our participants in the North Carolina Registry for Brain Health. Some of you may be on the call right now. I don't know who is signed up and who isn't, but if you're not signed up, I encourage you to do it. It's really just an information vehicle. And I thank you for your attention and hope you all have a really wonderful Thanksgiving. And I think we're open for questions.
Okay, thank you for the good presentation. I've been answering a few questions in the chat about enrollment in the registry, which hopefully are clear, but I can answer specific questions if any remain. At the time that you signed up for this talk, you were invited to submit questions, of which I have a list. Many were answered, I think, during the talk, but I have a few remaining that I'll ask, and then a few from the chat, and you can continue to enter them there. We'll go right up until 11. This is a question that was submitted early. The person would like to know more about research on Nudextra in particular, but drug combinations in general that may worsen agitation and symptoms.
Yeah, so I didn't dive into it, but many of the drugs that I showed when I showed that concentric circle of different compounds include compounds that are being developed for behavioral symptoms, including, importantly, things like agitation, apathy, aggression, and sleep disorders. So there are many different drug trials underway for those compounds. And some of those are actually looking quite encouraging. Currently, neuropsychiatric symptoms that occur in Alzheimer's disease and related dementia, there's very few therapeutics for those problems. And so we use compounds that have been developed for psychiatric illnesses to deal with those problems, either antidepressants or antipsychotics. So some of these new compounds that are coming out are looking very promising. The one that was mentioned, Nudextra, is a compound that was developed, it is available for pseudobulbar affect, which is a problem where individuals have difficulty regulating emotion, and that often happens or can happen after stroke or traumatic brain injury. It can also happen in ALS and MS. So that's a compound that's been approved for that. It was approved in 2011, and in the subsequent years has been used in an off-label way in Alzheimer's disease. It did go to clinical trial in Alzheimer's disease and did not look effective in Alzheimer's disease. So some of these compounds are being used off-label, and there is no evidence that they would necessarily work in those patients. Also, in combination with other therapies, there's very little evidence or knowledge of how they might interact with currently accepted compounds like the cholinesterase inhibitors. So one always has to be very cautious when taking a new medication that hasn't been studied in that way. So I hope that answers that question, but there are a lot of other compounds right now that are under evaluation. There is one compound in particular that's being looked at with an eye towards helping in psychosis, and that'll probably be before the FDA soon. And so we're hopeful about that, but just a number of other drugs that are under development. I was going to say, I looked quickly on clinicaltrials.gov and Alz Forum before coming on this call. It looks like there's about 14 different trials right now for these neuropsychiatric problems. One is in apathy, 3 are in sleep. One of those is in irregular sleep-wake rhythms. And then there's 8 different compounds that are looking at agitation, and then that one for psychosis that I mentioned.
Okay, thank you. We have had quite a few questions about supplements that you see advertised on television. Can you speak to the effectiveness or lack thereof for those?
Yeah, so some of our own work even looked at what people were taking in terms of supplements and what might be neuroprotective. And there was a body of evidence, this is a number of years ago now, that showed that antioxidant vitamins, particularly C and E, when used together, might be protective. And there was some evidence that nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories may also be protective. And so many of these direct-to-consumer ads that you see are building off of that epidemiological evidence and animal work that suggests some of these vitamins and nutrients might be helpful. I think the more current analyses are suggesting that a lot of the benefit of these different vitamins actually comes from our food sources. And so that unless you're having a problem in getting those vitamins from food sources, you shouldn't really need to take supplements like this to enhance your brain health. So again, really trying to adhere to a healthy diet, and if needed, supplement with supplements with your physician knowledge of that. Again, just because you're not getting the appropriate nutritional elements from your own diet.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about cognitive assessments and whether there have been advancements in evaluating whether a person has Alzheimer's disease or other dementias?
I love that question.
I know you do.
As a neuropsychologist, I love that question. So, so as a neuropsychologist who's been doing this for over 30 years, I know how painful it is to go through testing. And so one of my passions is really to develop tools that will be valid, reliable, useful, and keep in mind what it's like to actually go through those tests yourself. So there's been a lot of work, particularly since COVID, to try and accelerate those tools because we've had to go to telehealth and be more reliant on technology. So there's a lot that's happening to develop better and reliable tools for detection, particularly in the early ambiguous phase of the illness, where it's very difficult to tell, is this just normal aging or disease? And so a number of investigative teams, there are several that I think are really promising, one out of Harvard, one out of WashU, another group out of UC Irvine, that have developed tools that are very rigorous from a neuroscience perspective in terms of measuring memory and other functions, and use a person's own smartphone or device where you would log in and go to an app and record information on a daily basis. Those are looking very promising. They're not available yet because there is a lot of work that has to go into validation. And we have to make sure people will actually adhere and use them in a reliable method and not give them to their grandchild to take for them and that kind of thing. But these tools are looking very promising. And we also have different current tools. So the tests that we've been using for years now that are on digital devices and are able to capture data not only more reliably because it's on a computer interface, but also allows other kinds of variables that we haven't been able to collect before, like the time it takes to do something. And we can measure then changes in how people are approaching testing over time because it's taking them longer to figure things out. So there's new information that's coming from these tests that's much more helpful, I would say, to the clinician, and those things are becoming more available in the very near term in terms of what we do in clinic and what we do in research. So it is a growing field. Just because we're getting closer to having a blood biomarker does not replace the need for a cognitive test. So the cognitive test is what I call the most proximal measure to the disease. It's the closest thing to the disease because the disease affects cognition. So we still need the cognitive test to provide a baseline or a barometer of where the person is now. And they're also the most strongly predictive of decline. So if we see a person, we test them today, we test them tomorrow, that change score is more predictive of decline than any of those biomarkers that we currently have available. So the change scores in cognition are a very strong biomarker for predicting who's at imminent risk for getting worse over time.
Thank you. That's a good segue into another question that we got, referencing the 60 Minutes piece that was on Sunday, which I have not seen. I don't know if you have, but I've heard about it. The question is, the 60 Minutes piece implied that the researcher found that people in the 90 plus study, their brains did not always, it was not always successful in identifying people with dementia. I assume that's scans, but.
Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't watched that piece. I will after this call, so that I was actually not even aware it was on. So I will look at it. What I can say is that we have to be really careful when we talk about biomarkers, that we aren't saying that if you have the biomarker, you have the disease. What we're understanding is that having the increased amyloid in your brain or having tau biomarkers increases the risk that you would have symptoms later on. It strongly increases the risk. But we do know that there are examples of people who have those biomarkers and yet don't develop the cognitive symptoms anytime soon and maybe die in their 90s without having the symptoms. So it's not an absolute predictor. It's a very strong predictor of people that are going to go on to have symptoms, but it's not an absolute yet. And so there may be things that are also protective within our brains that are able to help some people buffer just a lot of that injury that's happening, and yet they still don't develop the illness. So my suspicion is that it may be related to that, and it may be related to the observation that keeping your brain active helps to buffer against some of this. So even if you have the pathology going on, learning new things, trying to keep it as engaged as possible gives the brain the potential to have redundancy in it with new connections forming that help to kind of cushion the blow, if you will, of these diseases that are occurring. That's my guess as to what that was about, but I will have to circle back and let people know after I watch 60 Minutes.
So you talked some about early stage treatment. For those identified in the later stages of Alzheimer's disease, what does treatment look like for them?
Yeah, so a lot of different things are happening. So it is correct that some of the treatments that work early in the disease are probably not going to be effective later in the disease. So case in point, if amyloid is a triggering phenomenon, then treating amyloid once you're fully expressed probably isn't going to have a big impact. But maybe changing tau, which happens a little bit later, would have an impact. So these different therapies are kind of tackling different parts of the disease progress. And so many of the compounds that are being looked at for the later stages of the illness are looking at things like inflammation that may be occurring and sort of the body's own immune response to these pathologies to try and kind of quell that problem so that it doesn't progress as quickly in those patients. And then, of course, there's the symptomatic treatments that are being looked at to treat the behavioral problems that we know are very vexing for caregivers, but also create excess disability for the patients themselves that are having trouble with agitation and apathy, for example.
We are almost out of time. One question that we got that was sent in early had to do with how to support families who are have a family member living with dementia, and that would probably be a very long answer. But Heather said this at the top of the call that we have a lot of representation from various formal services on this call, like the Dementia Alliance, the Duke Dementia Family Support Program, Alzheimer's Association. And it hasn't been mentioned yet, but I do want people to know that if you go to the North Carolina Registry for Brain Health website, there is a tab that lists resources, and it is not meant to be exhaustive, but it is a really good place to start when thinking about education, finding supports. And so a lot of the agencies that are on this call are listed there, as well as some other places to go to learn more about the specific dementias. So want to make sure people know about that.
And Rachel, that actually is a perfect segue into what I was just going to mention is we have a couple more webinars. So first, thank you, Kathy and Rachel, for partnering with us to put this on today. This has been fantastic. And I feel like it's just the tip of the iceberg on all the things we could sit here and talk for hours, probably, on all the things, and people would love it. So a couple of plugs for some upcoming education things that we have going on. We have a Q&A with Melanie Bunn coming up on December 2nd, and that will be free. So please join us for that if you have those support type questions. And she's fantastic. We also have a two-day kind of conference. It'll be virtual in February for LBD specific and talking about behaviors. So that's February 10th and 11th. And then on the research front, we are going to be, so Dementia Alliance does fund some research here in North Carolina. And so we will be hearing from those researchers right here in our state that we have funded their projects. And so we'll be sending out more information on that, but that'll be in the first part of the year as well. So I just wanted to plug that. And if there's specific topics that you guys would love to hear, let us know. We are going to be making today's recording available on our YouTube channel so people can refer back to that, and we will look at having also the slides. And then Lisa is going to be sending out a evaluation of today. So please fill that out. That helps us know what you guys want and what you guys need to hear from and to hear about. And so it shouldn't take more than 5 minutes, but we would really appreciate you filling that out for us. And then if for more information and for details and other resources, please visit our website. We are, again, a nonprofit organization. So if this is something that you have enjoyed, your support is always welcomed and encouraged. But, you know, we have a vast amount of information there, and then our whole entire team is available to you as you need us. We've got great support group leaders, those in your area, and Dee Dee's also available for families just to chat one-on-one as well. So thank you for being here today and joining us and being a part of this community. And thank you to Kathy and Rachel again.